Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Good. All right. Thank you. Apologies. Bad start. Anyway, so thank you very much. So apologies for two things. First, that I'll be speaking in English. And I do understand German, so please ask questions in German. But the agreement was that we would do this in English. And I guess apologies for being a man amongst this illustrious group, but also that I can't change. So what I wanted, I think this is so please interrupt, right? I'll try to keep us going, but it's always more fun and more interesting if people ask questions along the way. Because if you have a question in your mind, then probably somebody else also has a question. So you'll be doing somebody a favor by asking it. So what I want to talk about today is, my perspective on climate policy. And I think it's incredibly important because the sector that you work in, it actually, and it was all recently mentioned, but is responsible for almost 40% of the emissions globally, which is huge. So this is both the construction of buildings and the exploitation of buildings, so heating, lighting, etc. So it is absolutely the biggest chunk of the whole climate problem in terms of emissions. So I think it's a really important topic, and I'm really happy that you're looking at it. So how did I get into this? So thank you for the brief introduction. I've done all sorts of different things. I'm a physicist originally, and I've always been interested in how do systems work? How does actually something come into being? And I worked in industry for quite a while. I worked for Shell for about 12 years. And now for the past 12 years, have been both a writer and working at various universities. And I also work for the UN, for UNEP in Paris on methane emissions issues, which is a separate from buildings. There's another huge climate policy issue. But I wrote these two books, right? One is about complexity, and I'll go into these things. One is about complexity and the art of public policy. And there is a slow motion revolution going on in Western science that's been going on for about 30 years, which we keep secret to most people who are at university, except when they get a PhD. But I'll tell you a little bit about that. But it has enormous consequences for the way we view the world and for the way we organize ourselves. And for many public policy issues, and not least of it for this issue of climate policy. And so I wrote a second book, the one on the right, called A Climate Policy Revolution, which has as a subtitle, What the Science of Complexity Reveals About Saving Our Planet. And a lot of the focus in these books is about the how of doing things in the world. We're obsessed with the what. We need, nuclear, or we need hydrogen, or we should do this, we shouldn't fly, we should do, which are all wonderful things to exchange with people over a beer or a cup of tea or something, but it actually doesn't change anything. And unless you've really not been paying attention, it's quite clear what we need to do to fix the climate. There are about half a dozen things we need to do, and they're not very difficult. The really difficult thing is, why aren't we doing them? And how could we do these things? So the what actually is the easy part. Yeah, people disagree on a few things, but in essence, I think those are solvable. But the much more difficult question is how we get these things done. And so that's what I concentrated on in this book, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about today. So the first thing, and this is the only thing I'll say about climate, in the assumption that nobody needs convincing that this is a real problem. But just to give you a sense of how bad things are, here's a slide that shows the carbon emissions from about 2000. And this is a somewhat older slide, and it looks at what pathway, what reduction in CO2 do we need to achieve every year to get to 1.5 degrees? And so basically what you see is we've basically done nothing. And now, we're in 2022, and by 2025, we actually have to stop emitting CO2 entirely that same year. So there is almost no time left. and we've basically done as good as nothing. So all of the wonderful talk about ESG, and I was the head of sustainability for Shell 20 years ago and published an ESG report and etc. None of this makes any difference. None of it's relevant because none of it works. And so the question is understanding why, and particularly how can we do something differently that actually does work. And not surprisingly, it's not so easy. But the first question is really, why have we sat on our hands, right? You know, why are we doing nothing? And I mean, we're doing nothing. I mean, of course, we're doing a few things, but we're not doing anything that's proportional to the urgency of the problem. And if you're in a sinking boat, surely if you say, well, we're just getting a little bit of the water out, that is really not very interesting. The question is, are you getting enough water out to keep the boat from sinking? And we're clearly not. And what I state in the book is it isn't ill intent, or it isn't that people are stupid, or that we don't understand what needs to be done. But part of the problem is that all of the solutions and our systems we have are so deeply interconnected that we've got this kind of spaghetti ball that's very hard to get into motion. You know, everybody says, I want to do something, but my shareholder, my tenant, my, you know, whatever doesn't allow it, or there's always a reason and a connection. And these things are true, right? They're not excuses, they're true. You know, there are real constraints in the world why we cannot take any action on climate change. And so the premise I put out in the book is that that's the question we should be asking ourselves, is how do you change systems that are stuck together like a badly cooked spaghetti bowl, right? That's entirely stuck together. How do you change those kinds of structures, as opposed to saying, you know, all these point solutions is, you know, we need to make green roofs compulsory, or we need to do this, or we need to discourage air travel, which are all things that are in themselves true, but simply don't happen because they're tied to all these other issues. So that's what I explore in the book. And this reflection on systems and how they work is one that we know that's familiar in biology, in the science of biology, and in the arts, where there's a real reflection on systems and interconnections, and actually also in our private lives, right? We use a different logic in the way we live our lives. You know, nobody would think that the success of a party is the sum of the music, the alcohol, and the people that are there, right? It's the interconnection between the people that makes a party successful. And so understanding the interconnections and how this spaghetti bowl works is absolutely essential. And yet the scientific culture that we have, which is one that has been with us for the past 200 years since the Enlightenment in the late 18th century, is one whereby we isolate problems. We say, okay, let's look at this little bit of reality and find a solution for that and move forward with it. And that has served us well. I mean, you know, we have a world that's not perfect, but certainly a hell of a lot better than it was 200 years ago. Except we've now hit a wall. We found an issue on climate change and actually also the loss of biodiversity, where this approach of looking at peace as things independently simply isn't working. So what we need is a science of interconnected systems. Now, the good thing is that we actually have that. And also that isn't perfect, but there is, since about 30 years, there's a science of interconnected systems, which goes under the names of complexity science, which is not a great name for a science, I grant you. And it deals with interconnected systems. There is today not a single university in the world that does not have a complex systems institute across multiple disciplines. I recently had to check, the University of Tehran has actually quite an impressive complexity institute to do some wonderful work. And every German university has complexity institutes. Again, so this is at the heart of Western science. It just doesn't make it through to politicians and policy, etc. yet. So I'll give you a little bit of a taste on how we can look at things through this perspective. So why do I show this image? The cliche example of complexity science are bird flocks, right? You've all seen bird flocks, early in the morning above a lake. You have these birds that take off and they do these extraordinary things together, right? They flock and they make shapes and they reconfigure themselves. And have you ever asked yourself how they do that? Because we know two things about bird flocks, right? One is there's no choreographer. So there's no great father figure that tells all the birds what to do. And the other thing is that the elements of the bird flock are literally bird brain. They're not very smart. And yet collectively, they're able to do amazing things. And this is a classic example of early complexity science. And what people have done is they've reconstructed what rules individual birds need to follow in order to be able to do collectively the activity of flocking. And it is something to wonder about, is that these birds with their very limited intelligence follow three very simple local rules. And the collective effect of that is flocking. And this is a deep truth about how many of systems in the world work, is that they have at their heart very simple mechanisms, yet they lead to very sophisticated, complex behavior at system level. And birds are a great example of that. But it happens in crowds that try to run out of a football stadium, or it happens when fashion trends occur. So it's something that when a pandemic actually is a great example of collective behavior. So understanding that collective behavior is really important. And why is this important for climate policy? It's because in the end, we're interested in the collective effect. We really don't care whether you drive an SUV or keep your heating at 24 degrees and with the window open, or take an airplane every week. The point is understanding how our collective effect is different. And what we see in these complex systems is that the collective is not just the sum of the individuals. And that is a really deep insight into systems. And the question for climate policy is, how do we change our collective behavior? And so you need to understand the relationship between individual behavior and collective behavior. And that's not so easy. And this, by the way, is a picture of a flock of drones. These are 400 drones that fly over Burning Man in Nevada, I think it is. I don't know if any of you have ever been, but it's this crazy woke event that people go to. And these 400 drones have been programmed with the same rules as those birds. And without any central control, they flock. Like birds, spontaneously, they move around and reconfigure themselves. And so this at least suggests that with this, we really understand what goes on. Now, just one word about the name of the science of complexity. And the reason I show these wonderful Nigerian women with these rather amazing braids is that plexus in Latin means to braid. And so complex is with braids, and complexity means the science of braided or interconnected systems. That is what the word means. And the word complex, whether in English or in German, also means something else, right? You may have a complex relationship with your boss or with your sister-in-law or God knows what. And that's a different meaning of complex than what we mean here. With complex systems, we mean interconnected system. And so, open a little compartment perhaps in your head that you have complex in the sense of with a small c or a small k. I guess none of that works in German, but that means this difficult, this everyday meaning of complex. And then the scientific meaning of complex, which means interconnected, is how do we understand interconnected systems where the whole is different than the sum of the parts. And bird flocks is just one example, but I'll spare you the mathematics for today. But so that's what the word complex means. And one of the conclusions of the first book, which I just want to share with you, is that whenever we look at a public policy question, and whether it's climate change or financial regulation or building regulation or whatever it is, we can look at these issues through different lenses. And the first lens is probably quite familiar. It's the lens of control, right? Is how do we have rules? How do we have an enforced central way of making sure that everybody does the right thing? And that's what I refer to in the book as the economics of control frame. And there's a part of economics that's very much about that, which is central planning, government action, rules, regulation, all of that. There's a second frame, which is the market fundamentalist frame. It's people who say, no, just if you let market forces, it'll be great, right? The market is efficient and everything will be fantastic if we just leave it to the market, which is another way of describing policy and is another frame that people use. And what I would posit is that there's a third frame, which I refer to as the complexity frame, which looks at things like interconnected systems. And I'll give a few examples of that just after this. And the fundamental question for people who look at policy questions is which frame is the right one for this problem at this time. It isn't true that the complexity frame is always better than a market frame, etc. But we have to learn not to just advocate a particular frame when we look at a solution, because then it just becomes like a religion. People, I believe in the market. Well, so what? Who cares, right? When is a market solution effective is really the question. So let me give you an example of these three framings of the German solar policy. And the German solar policy is something for which humanity should be eternally grateful to Germany, because a small law, which was only 2 pages, was passed in Germany, which about, I think, was 10 or 15 years ago, which organized the feed-in tariff to if you bought a solar panel, you were guaranteed a certain price for the electricity that you brought back to the grid, and that unleashed a subsidy of over 120 billion euros for the cost reduction of solar panels. And the fact that somebody in Africa or you in Bremen can buy cheap solar panels is because of the biggest development project ever undertaken, which is this 120 billion that the German ratepayer has paid for cost reducing solar panels. This is an extraordinary thing for which, as I mentioned, the world should be grateful to Germany every day. But the question is, how do you think of this policy through these three different lenses? Because if you pick up one newspaper, maybe the Frankfurter Allgemeine, for example, they would say, well, this is a great example of the market working, right? We set the incentives correctly, and innovation occurred, and money was spent in Chinese factories, and through commercial innovation and private enterprise, this led to these cheap solar panels. But you could pick up another newspaper that says, no, this is an example of the Prussian state at its best, right? This is what Germany does, is, the central state in its wisdom has decided that the world must change, and it has created a policy that liberated enormous amounts of money on the world in order to get cheap solar panels. So it's an example of the central state at its best. And so that's the control frame and the market frame. And I'm sure there's stories, those are stories that are familiar to you. People justify policy based on those kinds of stories. And the question is, so what's the complexity frame, right? Is what is looking at this question through a complexity frame? And here, one of the interesting thing is that there are scientific studies that show that adopting solar panels is contagious with the same mathematics as COVID. So we all know about COVID, right? There's the R factor, there is social distancing, all these things to try to reduce contagion. But if you look in particular cities at the way the adoption of solar panels spreads through the city, it is the same mathematics as a pandemic. And obviously there's no virus involved, but how does it work? I actually have this experience here in my house in Amsterdam. Is I put up solar panels actually 15 years ago. Which was perfectly illegal in Amsterdam at the time, because this is a World Heritage Site and you are not allowed to put up solar panels. But what happens is your neighbors come to you and they say, hey, why did you do this? Is this cost effective? And are you now a vegetarian? And why do you still drive a Porsche? And so, it's a platform for engagement. And you see the effect of that is that you see that cheap solar panels actually are a contagious mechanism. And you see that the degree of contagion, just like different variants of COVID, the degree of contagion depends on the strength of the social fabric in a city, the degree of trust, the way the built environment is structured, so you can model all of this. But it's fundamentally a social phenomenon, and it's much less connected to markets and price incentives and payback times, all these terms that I'm sure you're very familiar with in the real estate sector, which really exist in this market frame. And a lot of this behavior turns out to be much more contagious and much more less economic driven. And my great fantasy is someday to be able to ask Angela Merkel, when she made this decision, whether she actually had all three perspectives in mind or not. So I still hope to be able to realize that someday. But this gives you a sense of how you can look at such a policy issue through this lens of an interconnected system, through this lens of pure market, or through this lens of central control. And they are very different. And I think this issue of interconnected systems is so important because, as I started to say, in the beginning of the presentation, I think that's why we're not doing anything about climate policy, because we fail to understand how to get change in these interconnected systems. So let me give you two examples from macro climate policy, a little bit unfamiliar stories perhaps. And then I'll move to the real estate sector, just a few examples from real estate, which you know a lot more about than I do, but I've tried to come up with some examples that are relevant. And then afterwards, a few examples which might be relevant from your personal actions. So those are the two buckets of things that we'd agreed I would talk about is, what can you do in the real estate sector, in your professional life, and what might you do in your personal life from this perspective. But before we go there, just a few examples from general public climate policy. So the first thing is inequality. I believe inequality is a huge climate problem. As you know, inequality is growing rapidly in our societies. I live here in the Netherlands, which has the dubious privilege of being the most unequal country in the world. Now, let that sink in for a moment, right? I don't think there's a single person in the Netherlands or even outside of it who suspects the Netherlands to be the most unequal country in the world. If you pick up the latest Credit Suisse report on inequality, you see that the Netherlands is number one. And Germany, by the way, is not far behind. I don't actually know the exact number. But what we've done is over the past couple of decades, we've let inequality increase dramatically. And so you could say, well, that's annoying or whatever, but but why is this a climate issue? We know that unequal systems tend to be more rigid, right? We don't have to have perfect equality, right? That's not the point. because we also know that that doesn't work too well. But the beyond a certain threshold of inequality, societies become rigid and they lose their resilience and their capacity to change. And so one of the issues we have in many Western countries, certainly in the US and in Europe, is that we've let inequality run up so much that changing things in society becomes very difficult. And this isn't a new issue. You know, this is a book by Rousseau from the 18th century and a discourse on inequality. But that ended up with the French Revolution, right? Is that at some point people come and get things. You know, inequality is, you can't increase inequality forever. But that's a social and an ethical issue, but it is also very much a climate issue. Is if we continue to, and even at the current levels of inequality, it's very difficult to conduct effective climate policy. And so that I think that is a real political issue and a real climate issue. But you only see that if you look at the entire system and you think about, you know, why is this system rigid? You know, why doesn't it actually allow for change to happen? Is, you know, why are some people so entrenched that they don't want anything to change? Because climate policy is about changing society, right? There's no way we're going to keep going without changing anything dramatically. So inequality is a climate issue, and I would invite you to think about it that way. But it's a macro issue, right? It's not one that you individually are going to change, but it's good to realize. The other thing I just mentioned is, you know, certainly the Netherlands, but I think also Germany is in love with hydrogen. And hydrogen's the opposite, right? It's an example of a totally non-systemic solution. It's actually, you know, through a complexity lens, this doesn't make any sense. And actually, I think there are good reasons to believe that this is not going to work. I was in Florence last week at a seminar of the European Commission, and the main person on hydrogen in the European Commission was there and gave a speech, which, you know, the only thing she didn't say was the conclusion that this was going to be a disaster. But I think people at the center of power understand that this is a incredibly bad idea. And the reason is because it's something that's looked at in isolation. You know, hydrogen in isolation is a great idea, right? If we had hydrogen, you know, you would have all these wonderful things that people describe. The problem is the interconnection of hydrogen to the rest of the system. So first of all, hydrogen is a very heavy greenhouse gas, and it leaks a lot. So if it escapes, it creates a lot of global warming, and it's very difficult to contain because the molecules are so small that they even evaporate through steel pipes. So a big hydrogen economy is a potential huge climate problem. But the other systemic issue is you have to make this hydrogen from something. And so people say, oh, we'll make it from solar panels. Yes, except that those solar panels are required to replace coal power. And unless you've replaced every last fossil power in the world, there is no surplus renewable power to make hydrogen out of. And therefore, you're indirectly always making it from the dirtiest fuel around. And so all hydrogen will be made from coal, effectively, you know, until well into the second half of the century. And these are all things that are only visible when you sort of step back and take a systemic look at these things. And if you keep seeing these things in isolation, then people fall in love with spurious solutions. So these are two, you know, I don't want to go through all of climate policy, but I just wanted to take out two you know, perhaps less usual issues. One, that inequality is a climate issue, and the second one is that hydrogen is a really, really problematic and, you know, probably stillborn idea for climate policy. Please do, I mean, if you have questions, do interrupt me, right? I don't, I get worried if nobody speaks up, because you've either fallen asleep or it's very boring, or I don't know what. So please, please interrupt and say if you disagree about. I love being contradicted, and so if somebody disagrees, that's great. So don't hesitate.
Just listening.
Okay, but raise your hand or something, and Sylvia will interrupt me then. So moving to real estate. So I have three angles on real estate. And again, I apologize if I'm naive about this, but so again, real estate is an enormous issue because it's almost 40% of greenhouse gas emissions globally. So it is the biggest climate impact in absolute of any sector. It's endless, it's like 20 times air travel or something. Right? If you think air travel is a problem, then buildings are a massive problem. Now we need buildings, right? So the point is not getting rid of buildings. The point is figuring out what to do with them. So one of the big issues, which undoubtedly you're familiar with, is that the value chain the system in real estate is excessively there's a long chain between designers and architects and engineers and contractors and the building owners and the people who rent the buildings. And the decisions about greening a building are taken very much are taken at various points in this chain. And the benefits of that accrue to other people in this chain. And that is a real problem that I'm sure you've come across. But that is one that you can actually solve, right? You're going to have to structure contracts differently, figure out, this is something that requires professionals in the real estate sector to fix. The incentives and the benefits need to be transferred across this chain. And that's not impossible, right? It's just a question of figuring out how to do contracts differently and structuring financial products or whatever. But without that, it's again one of those spaghetti balls that just refuses to move. And you'll have people saying, well, we really should insulate buildings more, or we really should do this, but it's not possible because of this, because of that. And those issues you need to solve. And that nobody else is going to do it. And this is really on your plate, I would say. The other issue is I was giving a speech recently at the Dutch Employers Association. So this is with several hundred both big and large and small companies in the Netherlands. And I'd organized that conference would be vegetarian. As you know, red meat, so it's particularly red meat, not other meat sources, are a huge climate problem. And this is not a small one, right? It's not as big as buildings, but it is an enormous climate problem. And reducing red meat consumption is probably one of the lowest impact ways of creating climate benefit. And it doesn't mean that people have to become vegans, right? That's not at all the point. The point is kind of eating 90% less meat. I have a steak occasionally, but like once a month or twice a month, and it's really reducing the amount. And so I was at this conference, and I'd organized that it would be vegetarian. But again, so what, right? It doesn't make any difference if a single conference is vegetarian. You have 400 people for one day who may not eat any meats. So what? It doesn't make any difference. And so this is, and Sylvia alluded to this, is where what matters is if there are people in this conference who say, actually, that's an interesting idea. When I organize my next conference, I will do that too. And a bit like the adoption of solar panels, what matters for individual behavior is the degree of contagion it has to others. Now, fortunately, we know that human behavior is contagious. And again, it's contagious with the same mathematics and the same modeling as pandemics, different parameters, but it's the same mechanism. And so the question is, in your sector, in the industry, when you organize events, when you take out clients, etc., is you touch many people. The question is not token reduction in meat consumption, but it's kind of a strategic perspective of, what are actions that are liable to inspire others to follow suit. So that's the question one should ask around meat consumption, is not, I feel good because I'm better than another person because I didn't eat meat today. That is really irrelevant for the climate. What you should ask yourself is, how is my not eating meat inspiring others to do the same? That's the exam question. It's the propagation of social norms. It's not what you do individually.
Well, there is one question.
Yes.
Is the waste of food even the bigger problem?
No, it's actually first of all, food waste again is easy to describe, but it's very hard to go after. But red meat consumption, the methane from cows, is a massive problem. That really is an enormous climate problem. Of course, food waste is also an issue, and we should deal with. But this is one that scales much more easily, because humans are not natural meat eaters, right? If you look at history, Japan was vegetarian for 1,000 years until the West forced it to start eating meat again. And there are plenty of examples that actually in our diet, we never ate very much meat. It's pretty much since the Second World War that this has become equated somehow with wealth. And we've kind of changed our social norms around that, but it has nothing to do with what we are intrinsically. But the point is not just the analysis, right? Is figuring out the exam question is, when can my behavior be contagious? And let me give you a small example. Is when you organize an event, you will all send out an email saying, do you have any dietary preferences? How hard is it to say, today the food will be vegetarian, let us know if you must have meat? Very easy. And I've tried this for a conference recently, and interestingly enough, there are 1 or 2 people who actually say, no, I need to have meat today, which is a little bit sad, but so it's this perspective, and I don't want to pick on meat specifically, but it's an illustration of the fact that we have to think about how things spread into systems, as opposed to how does an individual change occur. The other thing that's quite important is, I've had some preparation discussions with some of your teams around all the rules and regulations in Germany and in the building industry, which are many. It's important to break rules. And I don't mean this in a trivial sense, but when I put up solar panels on my house in Amsterdam here, and it was illegal, I did it in the confidence that at some point it would become legal, and it has, just last year actually. And so rules necessarily run behind what's required in society, because that's how we do things. Rules never run ahead of things. And so it is, I think this story is important. Good people break bad rules. And when I was working for the Potsdam Institute on some study some years ago, I remember somebody pointing out the percentage compliance of German buildings with building regulations is actually quite low. And the audit, it's not audited very much. So there's actually quite a lot of space in our societies to go beyond norms and break rules. Now we have to do it in a responsible way, in a way that's explainable to authorities. But since Franziska quoted Greta Thunberg, I think she would be entirely for breaking rules. And it doesn't mean anarchy, you're doing whatever you want, but it's being responsible and saying, okay, here's a rule around the building code that clearly doesn't make any sense and will be changed in the next 10 years. Let me just, ignore it. And that is absolutely critical, because we are not going to get to any kind of effective climate mitigation if we just abide with the rule set that we have today, because those rules are part of what keeps the spaghetti goal so clogged. And there are rules that need to be lifted, but you can't wait for them to be lifted. And yes, you'll make some mistakes and you might get into trouble, but that's life. So in real estate, the chain issues are a problem, right? This transfer across the value chain, but I think that's one that actually professionals in the industry can go after. It's a question of, creativity in contracts, it's talking to people, assembling, etc. And I think that is absolutely fixable. Is obviously, the stuff about green roofs, heat pumps, solar panels, etc. All of that needs to go into every building. The EU regulation is evolving quickly. But essentially every new building should be zero power, and old ones should be retrofitted as quickly as possible. But that's pretty familiar. The thing I would emphasize is ensure that limited actions are contagious. So if you do something small, make sure it's contagious, and get ahead of rule changes. Break some rules, but in a sensible way. So just a last chapter very quickly in a few minutes, personal contagion.
Sorry, one more interruption. There is a question from Bettina Maker. Bettina, would you like to ask your question yourself?
Yes, I would like to know how the building industry, which is quite conservative, unfortunately, can be attracted for rule changes.
You're the building industry.
Well.
No, but you're a part of it. Is go do it, right? That's my point. Is if it's conservative, make it less so, right? Unless we cannot just sit and say the industry is conservative. Change it.
Okay, thank you.
So just a few personal, because that was also a question, what can you do in your personal life? And also there, this theme of contagion is important, right? Is what can you do that's likely to influence others? Again, if you live in the middle of nowhere by yourself and your house is really warm and the windows are open, it's on the bigger scheme of things, it doesn't make any difference. So the first pretty obvious thing is, get rid of your fossil car. I mean, if you are still driving a fossil car, that is ridiculous, right? Today, you should no longer, and this is really table stakes, right? This is a picture of the Aptera, which is one of my favorites, which is not quite on the market yet, but there's plenty of choices on electric cars. And, there's absolutely no reason, literally this month, to be driving a fossil car. And think about so when I say this, listen to the excuse that comes up in your head, right? Some of you are saying yes, but something or other. There is no reason, there's no valid reason to do this. And the reason, again, this matters is not because the fuel consumption that you have matters, but it's because you are visible people in your community, and the fact that you get rid of a fossil car actually influences others. And I have, this experience. I've had electric cars for, God knows, 7 or 8 years now. I've got one of the first Teslas, and I'm now in my second Tesla. And it makes a difference. People ask, they're curious. They say why, and should I get one, etc. And so this behavior is truly contagious. And so don't put this off. This isn't a question of, oh, my next car or in 2027. No, it's literally, tomorrow, get rid of it and get another one. The other thing is yes.
At this point, I have a question, and there's another question on the chat. The question in the chat is, yes, buying an electric car, but in Germany we have no access to charging points. And my personal opinion is, the question is not getting rid of fossil cars. I think the big question is to get rid of individual cars, because we need to reduce the number of cars in our streets. And if we would have, in addition to all these, I don't know, in Germany we have more cars than households. We have 41,000 households and 46,000 cars. And imagine we would have 46,000 charging stations. That would be the next problem in our streets.
So yes, and I've written a whole chapter on the transport system, etc., and I can give a talk about that. So there is a whole issue with autonomous vehicles, etc., but that's a policy issue. So the question here was, what can I do individually? So you cannot get to autonomous cars individually, right? That needs to happen. But if you ask, what can I do tomorrow morning, is you can get an electric car. And Germany, like everywhere else, every 100 kilometers, there's a Tesla supercharger. And so you can charge your car everywhere. And just don't get a Volkswagen or something silly, right? Get a Tesla that you can charge anywhere. And so this charging problem is completely solved. Mm-hmm. And so you're completely right, Sylvia, right? Is we need to get to a different transport system. But that's a different bucket of questions than this is, what can I do as an individual? And as an individual, you can get an electric car tomorrow morning.
Lena, you put a comment in the chat. Would you like to talk? And yeah,
I would really, I totally do get your point, Roland, and I really like your introduction to this, and get rid of your fossil car. But maybe we don't want to really promote Tesla here, because the factory they built in Germany is far from being climate friendly. I mean, it's in an area where there's water drainage, always has been, and now this huge company is built that needs a lot of water. So I do understand if people from Austria get in Tesla, but people in Brandenburg, Germany, really have a problem now at home because of this. So I think what Sylvia said is, like, try to think alternative mobility first before you think get a car. And I wouldn't be able to get one tomorrow, to be honest, but I would be able to get rid of my car and start using public transport instead. Yeah. So I think the line you wrote, I'm perfectly fine with. Maybe the explanation and maybe the brand Tesla is something that I really wouldn't promote at the moment. So
two things. You're completely right? If you don't use a car, it's better, right? Because with public transport and an electric bicycle, you can get to lots of places. So that's absolutely better. But if you're going to have a car, get an electric one. And this whole water issue, what the hell, right? We're in a climate emergency. It's political. It's been whipped up by, the German car industry has been despicable in lobbying the European Commission to stop all sorts of things. All of these things are half truths. At some point, this is no solution is perfect. But if you want a car, if you don't want a car, and that's great. That's even better. If you want a car, get an electric car. If you want a car that you can actually charge the day after tomorrow, get a Tesla. So
because it's the lesser evil, I thank you.
Yeah, completely, right? And it works, right? And we need things that work. So solar roofs are really important.
Sorry, there's one more question. Annabelle raised her hand.
Yeah.
Annabelle?
Yeah. Hi, Roland. I'm thinking, how important is the definition of power in all the complexity we are talking about? As long as people describe huge cars as personal power and show their richness and their standard with all of this, if we don't change our values, if we don't find a way to find a new understanding of power and of our main reasons to live, how can we change any of this? Because the people who can change all the complexity and can change the system has to understand that we all cannot live if they don't understand that money is not the most important thing in the world and power is not the most important thing in the world. So what is your view on this?
you're completely right. The question is, what do we change tomorrow morning, right? And so I applaud it if you say I use only public transportation, and I think that's absolutely necessary. But my guess is that quite a high percentage of people on this call actually own a car, and the question is, how many have fossil cars? And so you're completely right, but simply stating, what should be doesn't make it so, right? The question is, how, the harder exam question is, how do you get there? And having a number of these personal things really matter, because we know this behavior is contagious, right? To continue driving your old diesel saying, yes, at some point we need to change your social value. And I'm not picking on you, right? You may have, Annabelle, a perfectly exemplary life. But we actually need to practically change the things that we can this week, right? This isn't, and you're completely right that we need to go much further, but that takes some of these other measures that we can't do in our personal lives. So when you get to your professional life, yes, you need to really start revolutionizing the building industry, because that's the biggest climate footprint, and you on this call have an enormous influence over that, and that is a real responsibility. But that's why I separated these things of what's your professional accountability and what's your personal accountability. And then, you should also vote for the right people. That also kind of helps when the time comes around. But fossil mobility is just evil, right? There's no excuse for having it. And the same's true for solar panels, right? Solar panels are great, but they're even more important because they're contagious, right? If you put up solar panels, your neighbors will, and it will spread around. So this is one of those examples of contagious behaviors that you need to literally, again, do this week, right? There's no reason to put that off beyond this week. And the third thing in your personal life, which would make a huge difference, if anybody has a lawn, so grass, get rid of it tomorrow, right? It's I think the biggest crop in the world, grass, and it's one of the most environmentally destructive, and it's very easy to replace with wild meadows, and again, that's behavior that's contagious, right? If you live in a street with all sorts of beautiful gardens and you rip out your grass and you replace it with a flowery meadow, you bet your neighbors are going to ask questions. And so this is the kind of thing that will become contagious. And it's contagious from one thing to the next, right? If you have a meadow, you're more likely to have an electric car, you're more likely to eat less meat. And so all these things actually are also these behaviors are connected, right? We're not just changing one thing, but we're actually changing the fabric of social norms around us in a way that's contagious. Anna has a hand up, is that?
Yes.
Yeah. Hi from Nuremberg in Germany.
Hi.
Thanks for these interesting insights so far. I want to get back to the car issue. I got rid of my car last year and replaced it by an electric bike. But anyway, you stated earlier that we don't have extra sustainable energy to produce hydrogen. But what about energy for cars? Do we have?
We do.
Okay, this is exactly my question. If I have a car that is provided with energy that is not sustainable, it's fossil energy, how much better is it than no car or than a fossil car?
So two things again. So it's already much better. A fossil car is actually is a very inefficient engine, which is actually also why a hydrogen engine is so inefficient. Any thermal engine is a bad idea. Electric engines are much more efficient. But again, it's this difference between what can I do as an individual in my personal life and what should change at the policy level. So, you know, this whole scramble, particularly in Germany, to import LNG is insane, right? To replace the Russian gas. I used to run Shell's LNG business, so it's something I know quite well. This is a very bad idea, but you and I cannot do much about that. And, you know, we should not import LNG, and we should build wind and solar like crazy, and, you know, produce some gas in the Netherlands to fix the difference, which is quite doable. But those are policy issues that, you know, I don't control, and probably you don't control. So this chapter is about what can I do? And getting rid of a fossil car is a good thing. And somebody else needs to green all the electricity, yes, so vote for the people, etc. But it's really important, I think, to bucketize these things, is do the things you can do individually, but the filter is that they should be contagious. And you know, if you have an electric bike and all these kinds of things are great because they really influence other people. But it's the influencing other people that matters. It's not just what you do individually, it's a secret.
Yeah.
And it's a different bucket from the things that should be done collectively. And don't let the collectives get in the way, right? If there's some water issue around a Tesla plant, yeah, somebody should fix that, but it's not a reason not to buy Teslas if you need an electric car, right? You know, or else we're back into this spaghetti bowl where there's always an excuse not to do something, because there's always some interconnected issue that means that it's a bad idea to do something. And it is true, you're completely right. These things are interconnected, right? Is the electricity as clean as you want it to be? And yeah, those are all problems. But we cannot let this interconnection just keep getting in the way of doing something.
Yeah,
and
so
that's what
yeah, I get your point. It's basically, it's about just doing something instead of waiting for big things to be done by someone else.
Yeah, we also need the big things to be done by somebody else, but again, through an and this is my last slide, is we really need to look at this interconnection lens. And so there's a whole science and literature on complex systems that's coming about that, you know, you may have the time or not to dwell into, but it's just good to know that at the cutting edge of science, people are actually starting to understand these things. But both in our personal choices and in your professional choices in the building industry, I hope, you know, my main point is, you know, try to have an eye for those interconnections, but also don't let it stop you, right? In a sense, if there's some rule that doesn't allow you to do something, then seriously consider to do it anyway, right? In a responsible way. And because this spaghetti ball, if we keep respecting every bit of it, there's always a reason not to do something. And then we'll continue to sit on our hands as we have for the past 50 years, essentially. So sorry, I've overrun a little bit, but there are a few questions. So
we have asked questions, and also there is already an answer from Lena. I would like to ask you, Fiona, would you like to ask your question again? Maybe the answer is also interesting for others. And in case Roland cannot answer, maybe someone else.
Well, my question was a bit probably naive on my part, because I just was quite surprised to hear you say, Roland, that grass is a really bad idea and that we should all have meadows. I can understand why a meadow is good. I just don't understand why grass is bad.
So grass is an incredible monoculture, and it takes enormous amounts of so from a climate perspective, it takes amounts of generally fertilizer, etc., to keep it going. Not in all cases, but if you look at golf courses and things, they're extreme cases. And fertilizer is essentially natural gas. It's a fossil fuel that goes onto it. So there is a climate impact. There's an even bigger biodiversity impact, which is an issue that's very closely connected to climate, but is indeed a separate issue. But it's one of those social norm things, right? The image of the house with the green grass, if it's replaced with a wild meadow, it starts this pathway of of image change, of norm change, that then, you know, allows people to then also make other choices. So it's part of removing the lock-in. So there are some environmental issues, and if you know, there was a piece in The Economist recently that, you know, articulated the you know, the scale of the damage, environmental damage from lawns. But so there's a direct environmental damage, but there's also this issue of social norms and contagious and changing our behavior and our priorities. That's highly symbolized because both eating lots of meat and having a nice green lawn have become icons of a kind of style and a rigidity of a middle class that really is destroying the planet in many ways.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Are there any more questions from the audience? Die Fragen dürfen auch auf Deutsch gestellt werden. Also wir haben doch wir haben einen, Fiona ist eine Muttersprachlerin, aber sie spricht auch fließend Deutsch. Insofern haben wir da kein Problem. Also wenn jemand auf Deutsch fragen möchte, bitte immer zu. So I would like to ask one further question. The current target to limit global warming is at 1.5 degrees. And according to scientists, we will exceed this limit within the next 5 years, at least temporarily. 1.5 or 2 degrees. Does this half degree really make a difference? Roland?
Yes. You know, I mean, it's highly non-linear, right? You know, the estimate is that with 2 degrees, you no longer have coral. And 1.5 degrees, you have coral reefs in the ocean. So if you want coral reefs, you need to stick to 1.5 degrees. If you think you can do without them, then go for 2 degrees. And that's just one thing, right? There are many other consequences. It's highly non-linear. And by the way, the climate models aren't very good, and the whole thing may be way off, but it's the best we have. So it's a very imprecise science. The reality is, if you were to take a sane target, you would say we should go back to pre-industrial levels of CO2 concentration. That's actually the only responsible measure. But you know, people no longer even propose that because it's so far out of bounds. But there is an enormous difference between a 2 degree world and a 1.5 degree world. And you may be right that 1.5 degree is no longer possible. You know, one thing is the number of refugees also, right? The UN expects 1 billion refugees, climate refugees. You know, I don't know, with 2 degrees, you may have 1 billion, and 1.5 degrees, maybe 100 million. So these things are highly non-linear. It's also sobering, for example, to think that you know, people obsess understandably about climate, about heat and flooding, etc. But the first really big climate crisis that has hit Europe was 1 million Syrian refugees, because Syria is very largely a climate war. And so, you know, and look at the impact of these refugees on Germany, you know, and on the rest of Europe in terms of the rise of populism and the destabilization of democracy, etc. If further climate exacerbation leads to 50 million, 100 million, or 250 million refugees into Europe, you know, what does that do to the stability of our societies and our capacity for dealing with climate change in the first place? So there is a huge difference, but you cannot calculate how many refugees you get with 2 degrees and how many refugees you get with 1.5 degrees. But it's certainly not 30% more, probably more like 10 times more, but I don't know what the number is. So it's very non-linear.
Fiona, you raised your hand again.
Yeah, I just wanted to maybe ask you to recap again the science of complexity. So my takeaway of it is everything is interconnected, and we learned about the flock of birds, that they go by certain rules, simple rules, but they follow they follow these rules and can create these wonderful forms, and that leads to this sort of pandemic or contagion, which in turn leads to us saying, if we all change our behavior today, right now, that will have an effect on others, and therefore we can make this change. Maybe there is something else, a few things I misunderstood there, but what ultimately will the science of complexity and this knowledge of this integration, how can that, like, how is it delivering us solutions? How is it going to make a real impact on us finding solutions to these problems? I'm not sure I got that completely.
Yeah, no, and you're doing an admirable job of I mean, you realize, you know, we've all been to school for what, 15 years, 18 years or something. And, you know, we've never been educated in systems thinking because that was not part of our curriculum. And so what's happening with this complexity discipline is that people are starting to learn about dealing with systemic issues. And so I cannot even start to do justice. You know, I gave you kind of the Reader's Digest version of complexity science, which is about what you can do in this kind of a presentation. But there are actually quite admirable things starting to come out of complexity science. But at a minimum, it allows you to understand why hydrogen is a bad idea, for example. And if you don't take a systems perspective, you just don't see that.
Okay.
And you know, there are other such issues, but there's no miracle solution, right? I mean, there's not some magical one thing that will fix this. And so my premise in the book is that we have to learn to think and look at systems, and from that perspective look for solutions. And my experience is that you then find a different kind of solution than you would if you didn't take that perspective. It's not necessarily a better solution, but at least we need to expand our sets of solutions because we don't have enough, right? Because we're clearly not making any progress. But it's something, if you haven't come across complexity and complex systems before, I guarantee you that in the next month you'll find an article in a newspaper, magazine, and it's worth sort of, you know, becoming more complexity literate over time. And you know, I found it incredibly valuable.
Yeah, thank you.
I have one more question. This event tonight is organized by women, and this leads me to one headline in your book, which says, "Real men don't do the renewables." In Germany, Merkel started the Energiewende. And today we have two ministers, our Minister of Finance and our Minister of Traffic, both male, who block, for instance, the speed limit on German highways. So what do you think is our attitude, our personal attitude, and our commitment to really do something with regard to climate change also a gender topic?
Yeah, I think it is. And like all gender topics, right, these things aren't black and white, right? It's not that all women and all men, etc. It's not the point, right? But there are some really interesting gender angles to this. Let me give you a few examples. So I worked in the energy industry for quite a while, which is a very male-dominated industry, and I dealt with, you know, the big German utilities, etc., which were all run by men at the time, certainly. And there was really the sense that, you know, we have these big nuclear plants and these big coal plants, and, you know, all this kind of renewable stuff isn't what, you know, real industrialists do. There was a real macho angle to this. Interestingly enough, I think there's a gender angle to hydrogen, because there's a belief, and I've observed it more with men than with women, is that we need molecules. We need things that you can put into a tank and control. And electricity, you know, like Electra, the Greek goddess, is, electricity is a very fluid, in a sense, more female thing in many ways, which you can't control, and people obsess about storage and etc. And so the whole hydrogen discussion, I think, also has to a certain extent a gender angle to it. And it's not something that needs to be overplayed, but I think it's certainly something that that definitely plays a role. And I think it's also in these, if you think about these frames of control and market and this complexity frame, this idea of top-down control is, in most classic theater is associated with, if you look at Wagner's Ring and Wotan, etc., it tends to be men who have those positions, and Brunhilde can only complain that she's not being treated as well as her brother and so on. So, there are real gender angles to this control thing, and so yes, but again, it's not a simple, black and white little issue like most gender issues, right? None of it's simple, but I think there's definitely an element of that in this whole energy transition, and I'm sure you probably come across it in your own sector, in the real estate sector, and when it gets to this, these issues of value transfer and how you structure contracts and how risk is allocated, etc. Those are all issues, difficult issues, but I think those are the ones that you need to tackle. Again, 40% of the emissions is in the building sector, in the real estate sector, so it's huge. It's by far the biggest.
I'm sorry, I don't know how to lift my hand here in this program. I'm sorry about that. So I just have to bump in. I hope that's okay. My personal feeling is that it's on a personal level, I can keep things sort of simple and decide on a small scale what to do and what not to do, and then maybe have an impact on others by just living it and others seeing it and talking about it or whatever. Having children who live the same way maybe, or seeing colleagues and talking to them about things, whatever. I mean, that's sort of the personal scale I can give. On a professional scale, my impression is, and I'm only a lawyer in the real estate sector, but I'm not sort of building myself or constructing myself, but it's my personal experience is that these issues are so complex, as you say, on a very, very high complexity level, with rules and tax levels and tax issues and value chains and financing things and international communication and all this, that it's very hard to find the hole to get into to start changing things. And my feeling is from your very, very interesting speech of today that there's a bit of ambiguity in the sense that on the one hand, we have to look at the complexity of things, that things are intertwined and that we can't just pick one string and pull it apart. But on the other hand, if we don't do that, we'll get nowhere. So what am I what am I supposed to do on a I'm a bit I have a bit of problems getting this into a mode to really work on it on a professional level. As you said earlier, we can change the contracts. We can try to realize things on a practical level, but it seems difficult as long as rules are there, which I can't change personally. So I need lobbyists or other ways to change things or to start changing things. And I don't really know where to pick the string to start untwining things. Can you maybe elaborate on that a little bit more?
Yeah, no, so thank you for sharing. It's not easy, right? But if it was easy, we would have done it. But you know, exactly what you describe, and from your position as a lawyer understanding these things, you have to figure out how to pick them apart. And so one of them is, which is uneasy for a lawyer, but is breaking some rules, right? Is, you know, if there are rules that are stupid, you ignore them. And, you know, basically you add a risk to a contract, right? Because you may, but, you know, then there's an assessment of how big is the risk compared to the climate benefit. And, you know, this is where I'm a little bit encouraged, and some of you may know this better. Is that, you know, actually there are enormous amount of buildings and there's an enormous amount of regulation that's actually not followed very closely. And so we can obsess about the rules when we get to contracts, but there's also a question of, you know, which rules do we ignore? And it clearly isn't something you should do in isolation, right? Is, you know, amongst this group of people here, can you form a little discussion group of, you know, how can we be more creative in our contract structures to be able to do these things? And this is a hard problem, right? I'm not suggesting that you change something tomorrow morning, right? You know, buying an electric car is really easy. You just, you know, when we finish this, you place an order and it's done in 5 minutes. But these things are really difficult, and but it is the hard work that you need to do in your sector, and it's really finding a few like-minded people and figuring out how to do some steps, but it has to get done, right? It really does, and just, you know, waiting for lobbyists or changing rules, as you justly described, isn't going to work. Right, because you don't know how to do that. Nobody knows how to do that. In any case, it'll take too long. But just break some rules, but in a responsible way. Right? I know it's not a very German thing to do, but you should.
Well, for a lawyer, of course, I can suggest to break rules, and I will describe the risks involved, but I don't take the risk. That's the difference.
Yeah. No,
my
absolutely.
client takes the risk. So
yeah.
I need to convince him or her that it's a good way to go forward for the climate, for climate change, to take that risk. And he or she will, of course, discuss that on other levels too than on the pure legal level. So,
no, that's right. But even just making the argument and trying to make a convincing argument about that makes an enormous difference, right? Compared to just saying, oh, we have to follow the rules. This is what you need to do. Is to say, well,
for sure, yes.
And you know, the more you do that, you know, we all have to figure out the space that we have to do these things. And, you know, none of us can change the world, but you can push the boundaries in your own realm, and you can push them much further than we do, right? Most of us are not nearly as courageous as we could be.
Thank you.
So the big challenge is to be more courageous, to be more committed, to be more courageous, and start doing things at the best tomorrow morning.
Yeah, there's a real hurry, right? There's really no, you know, delaying anything really no longer makes any sense.
Yeah. The original plan was that we enter into group discussions, but as the number of guests is declining, and we had enough questions to ask, I think we skipped this part. And at this point, I apologize that our guests who volunteered as moderators for the break-off sessions couldn't play their part, but I still hope it was interesting for you to be here and to listen and to ask your questions. So if there are more questions, please go ahead.
Yes, Maiken had just had her hand up.
Yes, thank you. But what I understand is that we can do it step by step. And everybody can change one topic. Maybe I will drive an electrical car from now on. And so I will do my very best on my private sector. But on the other side, I know a lot of colleagues are really good professional, sustainable consultants like DGMB, BREEAM or whatever. And and I'm a friend to ask them and to help, to get help from them, and then pick up one sustainable topic. Maybe I want to certify my assets, my building, what I'm searching for. So, and then I want to have a green certificate for that, and I want to do the refurbishment maybe for a building with I don't know, solar panels or whatever. So pick one real pragmatic topic and do it, because at the end I think now it's a new technology, and we have not much experiences. So I think do it. This is what I want to do. Is it what I want to talk?
Well, I think for your person, so I've tried to distinguish, right? In your personal choices, yes, do a few things and make sure they're contagious. That's what matters. When in your professional life, I think you need to be a lot more strategic, right? None of this is new. Solar panels are decades old. You know how to insulate buildings. All the technology is there and is, etc. And so it's a question of doing it strategically everywhere, is really having a plan to scale up rapidly in your professional work. I think doing token things in your private life, as long as they're contagious, is great and actually important. In your professional life, doing token things or just picking one thing is really not good enough, right? That really is, you really have to think strategically, is what can be my contribution to changing the sector systemically? Because that's what you get, that's what we work for in the world, right? Is to change things at a bigger scale, not to do a little thing because we feel good about it and can tell our friends about it. And I'm sorry if that's not what you meant, but in our professional life, I think we have a much more strategic responsibility than just doing one thing. There we really should look at it more broadly. So I really see as a different emphasis, whether it's in your professional life or in your personal life, because of the difference in scale.
There is obviously one more question, but no first name. A. Schulze.
Yeah, that's me. Hi. Thanks for your input. And for me, because some other ladies asked the question about the professional way. For me, it started to change last year when the EU taxonomy got started. And I'm working for a developer, and I can feel that the finance people start questioning. Yeah, they not only start questions about finance, but about green sustainability and also on. So it feels a little like it goes the right way. It's maybe not fast enough, but I think that everyone can do something in their professional way if you have ideas and how you could gain like money for your company. Yeah, you just need to find a good way, and you need to think strategic, like you just said, Roland. Yeah, but I think it's possible. Yeah.
And so if I can ask a question back, so you say that other people are starting to do things and you react to that, but what can you do to accelerate things? Because reacting is good, but making
if someone is asking, then usually you need a reaction. Yeah, so if like a bank is asking what kind of sustainability you've got in your building, what kind of CO2 footprint you've got, what kind of PEB, Primär Energiefaktor in Deutsch, yeah, what kind of water systems for urinals, basins, and so on. So I'm only a technical person, but from the construction side, of course, we can check the things. We can check the insulation, we can check the sanitary things, we can check the electrical part, and we can still watch at the older way of construction building. Yeah, if you look at buildings that were built like 100, 150 years ago, they are still in a good way, cool in the summer, and they have no climate input in it. Yeah, and it's good. They are really old, the newer buildings, sometimes they are only there for 25 years, and then we get rid of them. So the way of changing, I think, is started. Yeah, and there are developers that are the ones that are like more forward than others. Yeah, but I think the rest is following because the banks start to ask questions because of the EU taxonomy of the Offenlegungsvereinbarung, which was done in March last year.
Yeah, but my suggestion would be, suggest to the bank what questions they should be asking, right?
Yeah,
Don't wait for the bank.
They've got like about 20, 25 pages of questions. Yeah, that
Okay.
are really a lot of questions right now. And for the EU taxonomy, it's not like with GGMB or ESG or GRESP or something. EU taxonomy is like 100% or 0%. There's nothing between it.
Yeah, but so I don't want to pick on this specific thing, but just trying to say that instead of, of course, if banks are asking, you should respond to them, but try to get ahead of it and suggest to the bank, maybe they can ask better. Are the questions good that they're asking?
That's what we're doing, of course, because we want to.
Can you help them ask better questions? For example, this is a different thing. I had a long discussion with the climate people from Krupp yesterday, which is a local steel company with a certain reputation. Yeah. And they were quite happy about their calculation of the climate footprint of steel because of some other initiative I'm involved in for the UN. And the basis of the numbers that they were using were completely vacuous, right? They were using numbers that have no empirical value. And so we had to convince them that you have to ask different questions. Is why do you assume that these numbers are worth anything? So we can you help your bank? Can you help other people make sure that they actually ask the right questions? Are they just following a regulation, or can you help them ask even better questions?
Yeah, most banks have their own regulations right now. Most banks have their own sustainability departments, which are made up like 1 or 2 years ago. Yeah, and most of the banks started to ask the question because they need to. Yeah, they differ a little from each bank because each bank has a different sustainability department. But of course, we are working on it. And of course, we know which questions may come. Yeah, because everyone can read the EU taxonomy. And most of people maybe not know correctly what's in it, but the kind of questions are similar.
But again, what I'm trying to get to you is, can you help people ask better questions instead of just waiting for them to ask questions because the EU tells them to ask questions? Because also the banks don't know what they're doing, right? They just read this and they don't understand. And you have knowledge that can help banks implement the regulation better. So anyway, so push back on all these things, right? Because we all need to be more creative and more challenging for the things around us, I think. And I'm sorry, I'm not trying to pick on you, but it's just the example of just reacting. Everything around us is much too slow, right? The EU regulation is too slow. What the banks are doing is too slow. None of that is going to get us to where we are. So that status quo, the whole we're doing ESG reporting, etc. None of that is adequate, right? So we have to find a way to actually improve and dramatically change and make that sharper and more challenging. Just accepting the status quo of environmental policy is leading to disaster.
I think experts would start to ask the right questions. We could also avoid a lot of greenwashing.
And call out greenwashing, right? Is when you have expertise and you see somebody greenwashing. Anyway, obviously in a polite way, there's no reason to get greedy, but yes, when you have knowledge, call out greenwashing, yes.
Okay. So we are losing participants more and more. And I think with regards to time boxing, we should come to an end. I thank you very much, Roland, for being here with us tonight and for giving us your insight. I thank all of you for being here, and I hope we get inspired we get more impatient and we all start doing things. We all start changing things on private level and even more important on a professional level. And yeah, if you are interested, our 2 expert groups would like to continue to organize more events. So give us your feedback. Please give us your input. What are you interested in? What would you like to hear, to discuss? And yeah, from my side, thank you very much for being here with us.